I'd like to welcome you all to this event of the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility. The event's about Darrin McMahon's new book, Equality, The History of an Elusive Idea. So I'm Scott Ashworth, professor at the Harris School. I will be sort of directing traffic up here this afternoon. So the book, to read Equality, The History of an Elusive Idea, is to be guided through a sequence of images, what equality looked like to people over a really broad span of time, from prehistory to now. And the first thing that really struck me about that journey is just how much diversity there is in what equality looks like. So as you move from classical Greece to the early modern Atlantic world to now, or if you move from Karl Marx to Carl Schmitt, you see this one idea, equality, which actually is much more complicated than that. There's some commonalities underlying equality in the story. Equality is always the equality of some particular group and in some particular respect. But those dimensions of difference actually span an incredibly rich space of possibility for thinking about equality. And so it's much more than you would think from just thinking about today's debates. For example, the debates over inequality that are so much a part of places like the Stone Center, or debates that are going on around us about whether equality's time has passed, with something called equity waiting in the wings to replace it. So I think that's just a fascinating story. But I've been on this side of the Midway for 15 years, and so I know it's also good to have sort of a more practical spin on why you should read the book. And I think in this case, I would say that having that kind of picture laid out for you to see that diversity of thinking is really important and valuable if you want to be thinking about those contemporary debates. When you do so, it is unsettling in the best possible way, in that it upsets sort of the ingrained ways of thinking about equality that you come to realize are historically contingent and not natural facts of the way things have to be. And so I'm glad I read the book, and I encourage all of you to read it as well. But that's enough for me. You're here for these other people, who I will introduce now. So I'm very pleased to welcome Darrin McMahon here to the Keller Center for this event. Darrin is the David W. Little Class of 1944 Professor of History at Dartmouth. Before that, he was the Mary Brinsmead Wheelock Professor, and at Florida State, the Ben Weider Professor and Distinguished Research Professor. He's the author of, I'm not going to read the entire list, of many, many, many scholarly and public-facing articles, as well as 4 books, and editor of 7 more, is an intellectual historian of the Enlightenment, which is a central chapter in this book. And then going in order of the seating rather than my notes, we have Stephen Durlauf, who's the Stearns Professor in Educational Policy and the Director of the Stone Center at the University of Chicago and the Harris School. Jenny Trinitapoli is a social demographer who studies the causes and consequences of population change globally. She's professor of sociology at the University of Chicago, and she directs the Center for International Social Science Research. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Levy. He's a historian of the economy of the United States and capitalism. He's a member of the Department of History and also of the John U. Neff Committee on Social Thought here at the university. He's also a faculty director of the Law, Letters, and Society program. So, thank you. And off to you, Darrin.
All right, well, thank you so much, Scott, and thank you to my fellow panelists for taking time out. I know it's the end of the semester and it's a busy time, and I really appreciate this. I was actually having dinner last night with a friend, and I mentioned that really one of my great joys as a scholar is the opportunity to talk cross-discipline with fellow scholars around a topic of common interest. So I was really particularly pleased to get the invitation to come here, and I'm grateful to the Stone Center for the opportunity. I'm not going to try to summarize a rather long book in 15 minutes. I think that would end badly. But I do want to make a couple points that may well not come up in the discussion, but I think serve well to defamiliarize the concept of equality. And that's really one of the things that I'm up to in this book. I'm trying to take an idea which seems familiar in many ways and make it strange. I think it's clear that we here in the contemporary United States and in many other parts of the world besides are currently experiencing a crisis of equality. You will have seen the disturbing statistics that almost half the world's wealth is owned by just 1% of the world's population, that the 3 richest individuals in America command more than the bottom 50%, that structural inequalities bound up with issues of race and sex remain stubborn and recalcitrant. Such headline-making figures, though, tend only to reaffirm an intuitive sense that we've somehow lost our way. We see inequality almost everywhere, but equality itself can be difficult even to imagine. Well, I like to joke that I'm an optimist, or rather I'm a pessimist by temperament, but that I believe optimism to be a virtue. And so the optimistic scenario here, or the virtuous one, if you will, is that crises present opportunities, right? And this opportunity is an idea to rethink an idea that we thought we knew. Equality, after all, has played a central role in Western political discussion since at least the 18th century. And in my own lifetime, I was born in California in 1965, it was still very much a part of a collective horizon of expectations. Equality was what we were moving toward, right? However slowly, however fitfully, equality of race, of sex, of prospect and opportunity, of possession and of power. The arc of humanity bent toward equality, bent towards justice. An idea, of course, famously articulated by Martin Luther King, but which traces to the coinage of the 19th century abolitionist theologian Theodore Parker, and before him to the progressive ideals and visions of the 18th century Enlightenment, and farther back still to Christian providential thought. Yet it's a curious thing about equality. We've tended not to treat it historically. We haven't written its history, particularly its intellectual history, with the kind of energy or attention devoted to, say, subjects like liberty or freedom. As my colleague and friend, the historian David Armitage, pointed out a number of years ago, the conceptual history of equality remains almost entirely unwritten. And it might be interesting to talk about why that's the case. Well, fortunately, that is beginning to change. We're starting to see the emergence of a new historiography devoted to the study of equality. And one of the lessons of that collective research is that equality is not an exclusively modern idea, but in fact a very old one with roots in myriad religious and cultural traditions that has been put, as Scott said, to a surprising variety of uses in different contexts and different times. And so very briefly, I just want to give you a sense of some of that variety and to share with you a couple of the insights that doing this kind of history of equality over the longue durée can yield. And I've purposely here chosen examples that go against the grain of how we tend to think of equality today. So these may well seem somewhat strange. But one of the things that emerges very clearly is that many of the uses to which equality has been put are scarcely egalitarian at all. Equality, rather, has functioned time and again not only as a liberating ideal, but as a hierarchical premise, the basis on which distinctions between equals and unequals are drawn. There's no shortage of examples, but this one is fairly close to home. That's the 3rd century Roman jurist Domitius Ulpianus Ulpian, and you see the line there. Insofar as the law of nature is concerned, all men are created equal. Or this one. There we go. That's Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century. All men are created equal, or all men are birthed equal, depending on how you translate the terms. But the assertion by that point, by the 6th century, was in fact a commonplace. It's a widely shared dictum of both Stoic jurists and the patristic fathers, really something of a cliche, as it was, frankly, when Thomas Jefferson employed the very same phrase over a millennium later. And the point to note here is that despite the equal creation of humanity, neither Ulpian nor Gregory, both of whom, like Jefferson, were owners of enslaved people, saw any conflict whatsoever between natural equality and the very real inequalities of their worlds. For Ulpian, positive law and the dictates of the emperor took precedence over natural law, And for Christians like Gregory, original sin had blotted out the possibility of equal treatment in this world, where sacred order and hierarchy, both of those are Christian terms, was very much the norm. Equality for the true equals, the saints, would be measured in the life to come. Now that's by no means the end of the story. The Christian tradition, like so many of the world's religious traditions, has more to say on the subject of equality. In fact, I have a whole chapter on the book on Christian ideas of equality, as well as on some of the ideas of equality of the major axial faiths. And this is just one example of many from the 4th century BCE Taoist sage Zhuangzi, who in his collection of writings by that same name has a chapter, the Qi Wu Lun, which is a discussion of the equality of all things. What he means by equality is different from what we mean, but what's interesting is that later activists, right, for wealth equality or for animal rights or for feminist values, can go back and look at that document and use it as a touchstone and draw things out of it. And that's really true, I would argue, of all the major religious traditions. And yet what should be clear from the example that I gave from Ulpian and Pope Gregory is that the articulation of the phrase, all men are created equal, or all human beings are created equal, if you prefer, is not a magic formula with its own inherent logic that somehow naturally erodes standing inequalities. Equality and inequality, equality and exclusion rather, are perfectly compatible, the one often serving as the foundation of the other. And that would remain true through the great revolutionary era of the 18th and 19th centuries, when a world in which all men were created equal was, of course, a world in which some of its inhabitants and others served, some ruled and others served, a world in which men prevailed over women, the rich over the poor, white over black, and Europe and the New Europes over most everyone else. It was in part for that reason, I think, that Marx and Engels were so contemptuous of equality, not only in its liberal democratic guise, as you might expect, but in its socialist and social democratic permutations. That's a fact that is not always appreciated, and yet both men were consistent in deriding equality as what they described in the German ideology as the illusion of the era. Dismissing the fantasies of radical French revolutionaries like Babeuf or their would-be socialist heirs as so much Nivellierung or Gleichmacherie, crude leveling. They similarly dismissed the stated aim of the German Social Democratic Workers' Party to abolish, quote, all social and political inequality as so much nonsense and confusion, a prejudice of the past. And that phrase, abolishing all social and political inequality, is in the famous Goethe program of the Social Democratic Workers' Party that that Marx critiques rather in 1875. The goal of true economists was not equality, as this slide from Engels makes clear, but the abolition of class conflict. And so when Lenin, like Stalin, later dismissed the concept of equality as, quote, a most absurd and stupid prejudice, both men were on unimpeachable Marxist grounds. Indeed, there's no evidence whatsoever in the corpus of Marx and Engels' writings to suggest that either man considered equality, material or political or social, to be the consequence of communism. Well, if equality doesn't figure where you thought it might in the Marxist tradition, it does figure where you may have least expected, in fascism. I devote a chapter to that unlikely subject in the book, pointing out, for example, that the central fascist symbol, the Roman fasces, is a venerable symbol of unity and indeed equality, above all for Republicans in the 18th and 19th centuries in both France and the United States. In co-opting it, Italian and German fascists styled themselves the defenders of real equality, which they juxtaposed with what they regarded as the weakness and hypocrisy of liberal and social democratic equality talk, with its appeals to the universal rights of humankind. Equality was only for those who shared a common substance, fascists insisted, concrete similarities of common history, language, religion, and race that bound together the circle of true equals and set the others apart. As arguably the most trenchant of those critics, the Nazi crown jurist Carl Schmitt observed, every actual democracy in history had operated in precisely this way, establishing equality on the principle that, quote, not only are equals equal, but that unequals will not be treated equally. In Schmitt's view, the Nazi regime had what he called the courage to embrace what liberals denied to themselves. Now, I won't give Schmitt the last word, and rest assured that the book itself pays ample heed to stories that you might more readily expect to find in a book about equality in the way that we think about it in, or since the second half of the 20th century. Stories about the struggle against empire, or patriarchy, or white supremacy, or economic injustice. And yet the equality talk of people like Schmitt is worth heeding, if only because it's being revived self-consciously in many parts of the world today, not least here in the United States. But I don't mean with these counterexamples, these counterintuitive examples that I've invoked this evening to dilute the power of equality in a relativist bath. My purpose is not to undermine the pursuit of equality, rather it's to emphasize that we haven't yet fully come to terms with its complicated history. Only by doing so, I would argue, by telling the history of how equality has been imagined in the past, can we begin the vital work of beginning to imagine it anew.
We have more panel. Jonathan?
Great. So, pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the organizers of the event. Thanks to Darrin. I, like Darrin, am a historian. I think this book, really does convey the contribution that history can make to social scientific debates, including the contemporary debate about inequality, and that this is a really remarkably rich book, rich in its scope, rich in its analysis, and I challenge anyone to read the book and not to learn a great deal from it. And history is very much, in my opinion, a mess. It's a complete mess. And it's not the responsibility of the historian to say it's all a mess. That's not really doing the job right. You still need to find patterns and resonances and even mechanisms, but not at the expense of obscuring the richness and the surprising variety of the past, which this book does. In part because it does not fall back on standard narratives about the history of equality, whether those centered on a distinction between ancient and modern notions of politics, or even those that go as far to argue that equality is a recent secular Enlightenment era notion. Darrin breaks from those narratives. He tells a much more interesting and a much less teleological story, but he also finds new patterns. And I think the emphasis that we already heard on equality actually often marching hand in hand with hierarchy, if not domination, is certainly notable. But I think to me the most striking finding in the book is the long persistence of these axial age commitments to fellowship. It's an egalitarian thread that runs through the book, through the last chapter on decolonization and civil rights. And it's really fascinating. And I think historians will engage with and debate these ideas, these arguments. And with any luck, the book will provoke a debate and map out a new kind of historical research agenda on the history of equality. That's no small feat, so congratulations to the author. Let me now switch gears. And, well, first let me affirm another important intervention of the book, that the contemporary discourse on inequality, that's shockingly absent from it, is an informed understanding of equality. And that strikes me as correct. Now, this term here at the college at Chicago, I'm teaching a course called the United States 2000 to 2008. And just stay with me here for a second. I mean, we begin the course on day one, as we should, with visions of the millennium. And we read an address that Bill Clinton gave at the Lincoln Memorial just before the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2000. Let me quote at some length from Clinton's speech. The great story of the 20th century is the triumph of freedom. A story told of the drama of new immigrants, the struggle for equal rights, the victories over totalitarianism, the building of a world in which more than half the people now live under governments of their own free choosing for the first time in all history. We must never forget the meaning of the 20th century, the triumph of freedom. And so as we ring in this new year, we must now and always echo Dr. King in the words of the old American hymn, "Let freedom ring." If the story of the 20th century is the triumph of freedom, let the 21st century be the story of freedom wisely used. Well, that was an optimistic speech. I mean, unfortunately, arguably the 21st century, the dominant theme is not freedom, but rather inequality. And this has been a rather surprising turn of events. I think the period after the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, through Clinton's presidency, the millennium, I think through 2008, and I think Darrin's right here, is a turning point. That period, the central keyword in US and I think global English public discourse was not equality. It was freedom. I could go on at length here, and I won't. But this is not just a kind of ideological phenomenon. I mean, if you look at George W. Bush's speeches during the War on Terror, he's always talking about freedom. He never talks about equality. I mean, he never talks about equality or inequality, as in never. But even on the left end of the political spectrum, if you read such landmark kind of Supreme Court cases like Lawrence v. Texas, I mean, the court, reasons through it and says, we're going to root this decision in liberty, in a due process, 14th Amendment decision. We're not going to root this decision in equal protection. And if you even read Obama's speeches during the 2008 campaign, which I've been doing a lot lately, he talks about freedom a lot. He rarely mentions equality or inequality. Okay, so my point here is not that Darrin should have written a book about freedom instead of equality. Not at all. It's just to note that in rather recent times, the overriding ideological emphasis in our culture has been freedom, but that the absence of a discourse on equality or inequality, I think, is striking. That doesn't really happen until the second decade of the 21st century. And in my view, the outbreak, the veritable explosion of inequality discourse since 2008, I think might best be interpreted as a disenchantment with the post-Cold War freedom agenda of the 1990s and 2000s. Right? So it failed, and our era of inequality very much occurs only in its aftermath. I think here you have to sort of start with the war in Iraq. You have to talk about the global financial crisis. That's a different history. But this is my sense of how we ended up talking about inequality in our own times. Okay, so what then? To sort of think about freedom alongside equality and inequality. Let me make 2 points, because I want to stay on time, and then I'll conclude. I guess I wonder if outbreaks of fears over inequality have often occurred when there have been disillusionments with particular freedom agendas, as opposed to fear of inequality or concern for inequality as such, which might be the reason why the notion of equality often remains so vague. So our era of a kind of, if you will, neoliberal freedom giving way to concerns over inequality. But I think there's other moments which do appear in the book. Aristotle laments a lack of concern with equality in the Hellenistic period, very much after, arguably, a kind of dissatisfaction or disenchantment with the practice of democracy tied to an ideal of freedom in the Greek classical period. And likewise, I think a late 19th century discourse of fear or concerns about inequality followed in the wake of dissatisfactions with an era of slave emancipation in which freedom was, I think, the key word, or concerns about unfreedom rather than inequality. That's kind of one point. Second, I would like to ask Darrin if he might sort of expand upon moments in the book when freedom does appear. If I read it, if I didn't miss it, it comes first in the chapter on justice, on the ancient Greeks, which gave birth to the notion that runs through our own times, in which freedom demanded equality. They went together, right? You could only be truly free in a community of equals, although as the book shows, often that community of equals has placed itself above other human groups in a hierarchy. Then there's the chapter on the French Revolution. We first get the idea that freedom and equality, in fact, pull against one another. their intention. So equality involves constraining, if not diminishing, freedom. So there's these kind of two couplings between freedom and equality in the book, but it's a soft note, and I'd be curious, for Darrin to elaborate that a bit. My third and final point, and then I'll conclude. I really like the first two chapters of the book on the deep evolutionary past of our species and the shift to kind of egalitarian hunt. Usually when historians kind of write, it gets kind of annoying. I don't know why. Not here. Right? It's sort of right touch, right pitch. It sets the scene for the axial age, and especially Christianity, which I think that's the central chapter in the book as I read it, which you get a vision of equality and fellowship, completely delinked from any notion of freedom, but also any notion of domination. And so here I think, Darrin made the right choice, kind of set freedom aside and focus on the book on equality. So it's highly illuminating to read a history of equality standing on its own, independent from its relationship to freedom. But I wonder if Darrin might be willing, kind of normatively, and here I will end, to kind of double down on this choice and to suggest that the Greek fusion of equality and freedom was a trap that we can't think our way out of, or at least I can't think my way out of clearly. For it was a mistake that inevitably mixed equality with domination, a trap Enlightenment thinkers fell into, their obsessive joining of freedom and equality in that order, and that perhaps we fall into as well. And that perhaps the central sort of normative takeaway of the book might be the need to create in the future a new egalitarian tradition that, like the axial age traditions, critiques domination, critiques hierarchy, and critiques inequality by divorcing visions of equality from visions of freedom altogether. So I'll stop there. And again, congratulations, Darrin, on writing such a great book.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Jenny?
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Stephen for putting this book on my radar. I would have read it, but this event allowed it to rise to the top of my pile a little more quickly. And thanks to the Stone Center for putting on this event and inviting me to participate in the discussion. Before reading this book, I had really thought about equality as a clear concept by which I mean something that scholars and ordinary people alike routinely express in words, even though we've never observed it as an empirical reality in the world. Darrin's book has really convinced me, in fact, right from the title and the first couple of pages, that this is an elusive concept. And I'm coming at this as a person who's trained as a social demographer, and this is a tradition that the historian Daniel Scott Smith described without much admiration as relentlessly and routinely analytical. Others refer to us as the bean counting branch of the social sciences. We're not especially fluent in philosophy, but are concerned with the size, territorial distribution, and composition of populations. So with respect to conversations about equality, demographers are well positioned to speak about the possibility of and the trends in arithmetic or numerical equality. Now, arithmetic equality is the thin version of equality, the simple tally by numbers, accounting by lots of heads. The thicker concept of equality, in McMahon's words, is always about feeling, about passions and emotion. It's also about status and power, and very often about domination and exclusion. I want to suggest that the simple counting of lots by heads may not be so simple. Demography is relevant for the intellectual history of equality because it forces us to think about this problem of restless denominators. I take that phrase, restless denominators, from the anthropological demographer Jennifer Johnson Hanks. Populations in groups are theoretical objects. They're not naturally bounded in any way that we should take for granted. And this is true whether we're talking about nation states or about small groups. So translated into classically demographic terms, McMahon provides us with many examples of restless denominators. Where social relationships are altered by exclusion, there are a variety of processes that can remove certain people from the whole, reducing the denominator, or by expansion, where the circle of equals is enlarged through processes of incorporation, expanding the denominator. I want to frame my rest of my remarks around three things I found especially valuable in this book and add some thought about what a population perspective adds to how we might think about measure, and imagine equality. Now, my first takeaway from the book is really similar to John's first takeaway, which is that the serious treatment of equality has been a casualty of the reigning inequality paradigm. I've seen this up close. I study population dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa and some of the poorest parts of the world, with a focus on the causes and consequences of the HIV crisis. And this work puts me in conversation with scholars and policymakers committed to things like improving health and education, reducing inequality, and spurring economic growth. These commitments have become sacralized through the Sustainable Development Goals, and in my circle, this goal of reducing inequality in particular has become almost totemic, proceeding without an ongoing robust examination of what equality means or its concrete relationship to inequality. McMahon's text names this as a problem and gives us some tools for doing better. Quoting Martin Luther King Jr. from 1967, McMahon reminds us that readers may not even be speaking a common language when the word equality is evoked. King said that Black Americans proceeded from the premise that equality means what it says, while white Americans, including many persons of goodwill, proceeded from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. This articulation, that equality is not just a loose expression for improvement, hit me really hard. It pinpoints a decades-long discomfort I've had with certain conversation partners, especially as it relates to work on topics such as pandemics and excess mortality. When the head of UN AIDS, for example, talks about eliminating inequalities, surely she isn't suggesting that we elevate levels of HIV prevalence and redistribute the burden that currently characterizes Sub-Saharan Africa, evening things out across the globe. And when the US Surgeon General bemoans maternal mortality inequalities in the United States, he is not seeking to spread out deaths among pregnant and postpartum women evenly across the whole country. What he means is we should be working to reduce suffering, reduce misery, and ensure survival. McMahon writes forcefully about the blinders of the new inequality paradigm, even as teams of social scientists labor to measure inequalities of every kind, especially inequality of outcomes. And he's very convincing when he argues that this focus has stifled our ability to engage with equality without resorting to seductive vagueness. McMahon urges us to reset some intellectual habits that have gotten a little bit sloppy, and I find this correction to be an important one. The second point I want to suggest is that we have more to learn about how demographic shifts and perceptions of them can shape dispositions towards equality. Foremost in my mind while reading this book was whether the historical moments McMahon used to craft his argument were set against a backdrop of population growth, stability, or decline. Were the denominators shifting? How? I'll highlight two examples from the book that were really generative for me. McMahon shows us that the ancient Greeks thought about equality in mathematical terms. The notions of equality were manifest in emergent understandings of the universe, of the body in medicine, and the official weights and measures used in the city. This general interest in measurement took on political and moral salience when applied to the polis. These are the conditions under which the strong principle of equality first emerged, as Athenians also sought to achieve more harmonious balance and greater justice in their city. He describes reforms to expand the circle of citizens and efforts to reorganize the tribes, incorporating local villages and wards towards equality. For demographers, this is a clear example of a restless denominator in this case, an expanding one. And mortality rates are usually put in the technical and dry column, but it's noteworthy to me that this period was characterized by acute population decline, specifically the measurable and palpable loss of men ages 20 to 49 as measured by military enrollments and censuses. So we might consider how awareness of this shrinking denominator could allow for the expansion that formed communities of equals without precedent. In contrast to ancient Greece, Enlightenment Europe was a time of rapid population growth, the likes of which had never been experienced in world history. The decades leading up to the French Revolution have been characterized by many scholars as a classic Malthusian regime. It's also noteworthy is the puzzling fact that the period following the French Revolution was characterized by an acute preoccupation about sluggish population growth in France relative to neighboring countries. These concerns are present in the texts of many French teachers. Godwin and Condorcet in particular believed that there could be a state of perfect equality with equal abundance rather than equal poverty. As with the Athenians, these arguments for equality were paired with a bona fide preoccupation about losing people. Infamously, Malthus had a different take. Concerned about rapid population growth and its consequences, he believed that equality could only be manifest in equality in poverty, equality in misery. Malthus had the numerator wrong, but the denominator right with respect to arithmetic and equality. Godwin and Condorcet wrote about equality with optimism about the numerator and pessimism about the denominator. My third remark is a question to Darrin about the role of formalism for treating equality seriously. He tells us that equality is always and invariably imaginary, emphasizing that this does not mean that it's an illusion. Equality is first and foremost a relationship that we conjure in our minds in order to draw comparisons between dissimilar things. So what tools do we work with when we imagine equality? We can rely on history, engage philosophy, imagine utopias. But are mathematical models another tool in the toolkit scholars could use to think clearly about equality? On the one hand, from McMahon's account, I came away with the sense that quantification, especially in ancient Greece, was indispensable to humans' ability to conceive of and pursue equality as an ideal. On the other hand, I had the sense that McMahon is impatient with or uninterested in quantification, especially contemporary efforts to measure equality and inequality in the empirical world. Congratulations, Darrin, on this valuable contribution, which gave me a bouquet of interesting things to think about, much more than I have had time to unpack in these few minutes, but I'll end here.
Stephen?
So let me first of all thank everybody for participating. I realize that the invitation may have sounded like a joke where you say you get two historians, an economist, a sociologist, and a political scientist in a room and see what happens. But the serious point is that this is a wonderful book, and I think is an exemplar of how interdisciplinary interactions are enriched by the book, and hopefully will be engaging. So main thing to say about the book is that, from my perspective, like I said, it really was a movable feast. Every time I read a chapter, I went back and forth, I learned something new. My postdocs can tell you I was knocking on their door every day for 2 weeks and telling them, "Did you know this? Had you thought about this the following way?" So I have evidence of my enthusiasm for it, and it really was. The depths of erudition are just at levels that are honestly breathtaking, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to read the book. So what might an economist add? I want to talk about two dimensions of the book. First is kind of what axes that I perceive might organize some of the themes in the book. Now, in doing that, there's going to be a disciplinary difference, because I'm going to oversimplify here, and here in order to say there's some commonalities they're going to extract from this. And implicit in those simplifications, I will be focused really on thinking about a tradition that goes from Locke to Gerald Cohen in terms of thinking about equalities. And the second thing, I want to say something about teleology. And there I want to touch base with formal models, at least in economics and in social science, as to how one thinks about the long run. So it seemed to me that there was a way to think about this, is to use a phrase due to Sen and Cohen, that really this is the evolution of the idea of, and I screwed up here, I should have said equality involves the currency of egalitarian justice. And what I mean by that is that in understanding the ideas of equality as they go from Locke to Rousseau to Mill to Marx to Rawls, what I perceive is a couple of axes along which you have changes in what the domain is of the consideration of equality in terms of both its definition and who it applies to. And so what I mean by that is the following, and that is that if we sort of step back, and actually I was surprised that Mill doesn't appear on the index, so I'll tease you about that. This to me actually was what I spent the most time reading.
That's the book on freedom that's coming.
All right. I basically wanted to focus on the point. There's reading chapters in socialism, and this is where I want to say is kind of this key nexus. and that is Mill, the freedom libertarian meritocrat, makes the remarkable statement that the very idea of distributive justice, or any proportionality between success and merit, between success and exertion, in the present state of society is so manifestly chimerical as to be relegated to the regions of romance. And this is actually the answer I want to give on the freedom equality issue. My perception is that one way to think about the process by which ideas about equality were evolving was that there was a hope, which turned out to be false, and that is that the freedom, in other words, reducing political inequalities, would as a corollary produce greater economic equality. And that's the distinction between reading Adam Smith, where there's discussions of monopolies, et cetera, versus reading Marx, in which you argue that the system itself, independent of what the political equalities were being imposed, was consistent with growing and massive inequalities. And so that's why I seriously took the Mill's chapters on socialism. To me, was very immensely influential, because that to me is a nexus, is a point in which the notion that economic equalities would be derivative from political equalities gets called into question. And so I emphasize that because in thinking about contemporary notions of equality, which ultimately have to do with equality of opportunity in some very broad sense, equality of outcomes is somewhat distinct, but most of the debates have to do with equality of opportunity. Cohen, I thought, had a very important distinction, and that is what he called bourgeois equality of opportunity, which basically said that impediments, or unjust impediments, should be removed. Differentials in political, who has the right to vote, so on and so forth, the privileges of the aristocracy, so on and so forth. The second is he defined left liberal equality of opportunity, which was, and this is where the Mill quotation seems to me to have purchase, and that is it says something beyond injustices that the society's collectively implemented, but saying that there simply are circumstances that are unjust regardless of their origins. They're unjust either because people don't deserve them or because they're not responsible for them, if I were to go down those two routes in political philosophy. And then what he called socialist equality of opportunity was simply to say the inequalities, it doesn't matter where they came from. In other words, that the merit slash desert slash responsibility nexus really isn't the point. The point is that people don't deserve the differentials. So I put all of that on the table because I think that's where social science becomes relevant. In other words, the contributions to the evolution of the ideas have to do, number one, with understanding the interconnectedness of the domains. In other words, if I were to go through a set of arguments as to how I see contemporary egalitarian discussions today influenced by social science, I would give pride of place to two studies from the 60s and 70s. One of them is the Coleman Report, the most, this very extensive study of educational inequalities in the United States, which suddenly said something. It wasn't resources. There were deep, persistent roots to the history of racial discrimination in the United States that were not self-correcting. This was really a game changer in terms of the ways in which one has to think about policy. The second, I would actually say, was Christopher Jenk's book on inequality, which basically made an argument that contingency and arbitrariness were fundamental to the actual distributions. And so the upshot is, I think that where I see contemporary social science making serious contributions is integrating the social, political, and economic domains, and by implication showing there's no teleology. In other words, there's going to be something in the process of equality dynamics that is not self-correcting. Second comment I want to make is that there's this other dimension, which is who is the community of equals. And there, I'm not sure, social science does not have a glorious history, it has an inglorious history. On the other hand, what I want to say is that I think that if we're going through, whoops, let me go back, where social science has contemporaneously made a contribution. If I were to go to Franz Boas, to Arthur Goldberger, to Ned Block, what did they all do? They basically demonstrated the empirical falsity of claims about group differences. In other words, the essentialism associated with race or associated with genetics. And so where I see social science having spoken to many of these issues is by actually saying that there's an arbitrariness to the historical communities that has no scientific justification, and so I think that some credit's due there. This was a word I wish I hadn't used, which is a criticism. I meant to say something else, and I apologize for that. And that is one thing I think would be useful is if, in thinking about these ideas, is whether or not, and this is where formal models in my mind have a play, is that suppose I was going to restrict the domain of the evolution of the ideas of equality. And that's why I said it's not fair to criticism. You're talking about all this stuff, and I'm saying do this. And that is, if I wanted to move from Locke to Mills to Rawls, just to be concrete about it, how might one proceed? It seems to me that one could do the following, and that is to say that we have certain a priori assumptions about the moral equality of individuals, that set of who's equal, that evolves over time, partially for scientific reasons, and partially simply because social science tells about the arbitrariness of distinctions. Then the second question is to ask, how does that factor one interact with positive findings from social science? And so one goes down those routes, and I think by implication one has a distribution of positions on just versus unjust inequalities, and by implication how to think about equality as a social dimension. So in that sense, I guess what I'm saying is that it seemed to me that there's kind of an analogy between moral ideas and the way that we would formally model scientific progress. And so there the idea would be that there's a set of epistemic factors, non-epistemic factors that you put into the system. You have evidence that's flowing in, from research, and then you ask how communities tip from one consensus to another. I think there's actually analogies here that could be drawn if one pushes this combination of what I'm saying as the logical entailment of certain egalitarian assumptions, along with the way that social science knowledge has evolved. So that's kind of the first thing I want to put on the table. In other words, it seemed to me that this is actually a case. I honestly think formal models should be inspired by a book like this, because it said these are, think of this rich set of facts. Perhaps there's some way that a formal model can not just organize things, but maybe has a surprising outcome. And that's often how you judge a formal model is, did it explain the thing you wanted to explain, and does it have other implications that are in fact empirically salient and have this aesthetic of surprise, which is a meaningful evaluation standard for theories. As I hope Scott would agree with me. All right, that's the first point. The second point is I wanted to say something about teleology, and I thought this was really a fascinating part of the book, the discussion of how it seemed that the thinking about equality was so intrinsically linked to the idea that the arc of history is leading to that. Here, I guess I want to say a couple of things. One of them is there are, of course, theories of persistent inequality. In other words, which would be the challenge to the claim that history is moving towards greater equality. And the two names that are probably, one of them matters in the history of the world, the other is in contemporary social science. I do want to say with respect to Piketty, this is not really a satisfactory theory of inequality. And what I mean by that is that the Piketty theory actually is literally one equation. And that is the assumption that societies have a steady state of the capital output ratio that has to have some relationship between the growth rate of the economy and the savings rate of individuals. Now, when I say that's not a theory, first of all, it's not a theory because two of those are endogenous variables, and I could give you any set of dynamics that's consistent with it. They actually don't entail any of the claims that there's something about the past eating the present or R being greater than G. The second problem is that the claim that something like R is greater than G actually has strange micro foundations. In other words, it derives from an environment that assumes that capitalists have a savings rate of 0, workers have a savings, have a savings rate of 100%, workers have a savings rate of 0. You work out the dynamics of that system and then you get these types of phenomena. And of course, this is missing everything in terms of politics, in terms of the complications and thinking about the actual evolution of the polity, et cetera. So I think it's a fair statement that economists, by and large, have very little sympathy to the theory of inequality in the book. That's different from the empirical work, which is enormously important to have generated these data sets, but the actual argumentation on the theory, I think, is widely rejected. In my judgment, it is more helpful to ask a different question, and that is, what are the circumstances in a society in which we have what I'm going to call distributional instabilities? In other words, configurations tend to grow, inequalities increase. And there, I think we do have robust theories that explain these things. One idea would simply be the role of indivisibilities, non-convexities in systems. Nonlinear systems can have extremely slow adjustment rates. They create very large first player advantages. It mattered that Bill Gates was the one that IBM signs the contract with, so on and so forth. So in other words, in thinking about environments in which you have network externalities, you have various different kinds of what we call non-convexities, those become generative mechanisms for periods of increasing inequality. The second argument I would make is that we have to, and this is really taking history more seriously, I think economists often do, talk about the relation between inequality, equality, and growth. In other words, in growing societies, there's more scope for persistent differences between people. The mechanisms that are pushing you towards equality are actually attenuated by the fact that you have a larger support through which you have individuals, communities moving. And the third thing is simply to say that segregation is a very powerful mechanism to work against equalities. There's all these incentives for universities to try to sort by test scores, firms to sort by skills. I could go on. And the point is to say that in thinking about inequalities, a fundamental dimension, I think, for the persistence of inequality, and hence the failure of the teleological goal to occur, is the self-organization that comes from various forms of segregation, be it on non-ordered things such as race, ordered things such as income and neighborhoods, skills, and the like. So that's really what I want to put on the table. I will finally take one more minute, I guess, as the last person I get to do that. I think there are deep implications of this book, and for me, and this is, I'm actually started a book on meritocracy. This is part of why the book was so exciting to me. I've had to rethink a lot of stuff. And that is that the reason I emphasize this seems to be an important axis, because that has to do with deserved equalities versus not, and thinking about prospective dynamics of equality and the like. And so I just simply want, and of course, one of the nice ideas in the book is, as I've been teasing people, Marx was a meritocrat. In other words, the whole point was the focus was not on equality, it was on the flourishing of individuals, and so the free development of each. And so you really made me rethink a lot of issues, and that, for me, I'm very grateful. So final comment is Bertrand Russell said there's two motives to read a book. One, you enjoy it. I did. The other is I can boast about it. I don't think I boasted. I told people about it. But the other is it makes you think differently. And so I really thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks. So now we have some time for discussion. I see you've taken extensive notes. You want to
I've taken a lot of notes, yeah. Well, so I've learned from Jonathan that history is a mess, from Jenny that sociology is the bean counting science, and we already knew that economics was a dismal science, so we can come with that. I'm probably more comfortable with the mess than the other domains, but as I say, I really love this kind of interdisciplinary discussion, and I'm just tremendously grateful to all of you. And I have to say, I was blushing, whenever anyone pays me a compliment, I hear my late father's voice in my head, don't get too big for your britches. So, that make sure that I keep that quelled. I won't be able to respond to everything, of course, and that's not the point, but let me just say a few things, and again, thanking the panelists for these really rich and generative comments. I was, frantically writing things down. So Jonathan's absolutely right that, that freedom is central to equality, and it could be more central in another book. I think as he gleaned, I purposely sort of doubled down on equality, in part because if there are any intellectual historians in the room, they'll know that equality, freedom and liberty has been the real focus of intellectual history from the 70s forward. So the so-called Cambridge School of Intellectual History has really focused on liberty and devoted very little time or attention to equality at all. So it was a conscious choice on my part. But I do try to bring the subject up at several crucial points in the book, and one of them is the French Revolution. Because it's at the time of the French Revolution that what hitherto had been conceived as a dyad, equality and freedom, get separated. And I think if you talk to, if I talk to my friends in the economics department, they'll say that, well, economics and liberty, economics and freedom are always at loggerheads. And of course, the French Revolution made that very clear. In an egalitarian effort to make society more equal, you started chopping off heads. And so the French revolutionaries actually referred to the guillotine as the scythe of equality. And after the revolution, commentators and famously Alexis de Tocqueville, Mill too, and I had a chapter on liberalism that got cut from the book, and Mill appeared in that. But Alexis de Tocqueville famously says, the rise of modern politics leads to equality, and he sees this as something fated. It's another teleological view that equality is on the horizon. But what he worries about is the threat to freedom, and he sees equality as the great enemy of freedom, and that plays out in liberal democratic rhetoric through the 19th and 20th century, that liberty and equality are always opposed. I don't want to throw freedom out the window, Jonathan, not at all. But I think it needs to be reconnected to equality. Those two need to be seen together in the way they were for the ancients, in the way they were, as you mentioned, for the Enlightenment, as the way they were for Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other people up until the time of the French Revolution. So that would be my main point about freedom. I absolutely, endorse the point that Jenny made, and that I make in the book that, just removing inequality doesn't get you to equality. I wrote a book a number of years ago on happiness, and I deal with psychologists a lot. And the positive psychologists will tell you that just getting rid of unhappiness doesn't make you happy, right? You got to work on both sides of the equation. And I think this is true of equality and inequality. And the fact is that we've thought a lot about inequality lately, but not so much about what we're going to put in its place. And so at the end of my book, I cite literally hundreds of titles with very good works of history that focus on kind of movements, the struggle for this or the pursuit of this, always equality at the end of the horizon. But folks don't look at what happens when you get there. They focus on the struggle itself, and I think we need to focus on equality too. I completely agree that mathematics and empirical data is important. It's not my forte, and I'm hoping that the social scientists will come in and have a dialogue with the humanities, and that's on us, and it's on you to, I think, meet in the middle. So let's see. Absolutely. I mean, following the same point, Stephen, the social sciences can be relevant. They are relevant. They will be relevant, and I wouldn't want to deny that for a moment. I also take very strongly your point about Boas and others who demonstrate, in fact, I discuss Boas in the book, that the group identities are always based on fictions to some degree, right? And so the declared superiority of this group, I don't know, New York Knicks supporters over the Chicago Bulls. Well, that one actually is grounded in reality, but there are other ones that maybe not so much. But these are always fictional, and yet people are very, very good at drawing arbitrary distinctions, and this is, of course, a kind of central thread in group dynamics. I don't want to hijack things, but yes, meritocracy, hugely important. I think we've had some really good studies pointing out its shortcomings in recent years. The question becomes, what do you put in its place? And I hope you'll have an answer for us when you finish the book.
We'll see.
On Piketty, just very quickly, I'll note, because his work has been important to mine, even if we disagree on a lot of things, his little book, A Short History of Equality, actually has a teleological view. In fact, he sees a kind of movement towards social, material, and political equality embedded in the historical process. I don't, but I grant him the sort of courage of his conviction, and I sometimes say to people that we don't have enough optimism on the left these days, a kind of robust vision rather of what the world can be and can become. We've grown very pessimistic for probably good reasons, but nonetheless I applaud that optimism on his part, even if I don't fully agree with it. So let me stop there, and again, thank you all for these wonderful comments.
So I thought I would propose a question that comes out of all three, really, of the discussant comments, starting with Stephen. I hear Stephen as asking for more on a causal basis for these changes in the history of thinking about equality, which I realize is a very tall order, and you shouldn't answer directly. But I do think there are, to stylize, two kinds of answers. One of them is one that I heard, I think, in Jonathan and Jenny's comments, where things are happening and people try to understand what's happening in terms of failures of agenda based on freedom or changes in the population structure. And they try and understand what's happening to them in their societies, and they write these new stories of equality to help them understand it. The other one is, you mentioned the Cambridge School, the other one is these people were not always simply sitting back and trying to understand, they were trying to do things. And given the emphasis you have on the way thinking about equality can be functional for things like domination or hierarchy, it's also possible that there's a consciousness to that development of these theories. And I'm curious how you would think about those two poles in a possible causal history.
Yeah, I think this is a really rich insight that Jonathan suggested, that that interest in equality often follows from kind of failures in the project of freedom, and I think there's absolutely something to that. And ideally, if there are some graduate students with lots of energy in the room, to write the history of freedom and inequality together is, I think, the way to go. Causality, boy, that's a tough one. I was trained at Berkeley in the 80s when the spell of Foucault was still around, and so we just didn't care about causality as a myth. Right? So I'll resort to David Hume there, but no, of course that's a dodge. And it becomes very difficult, obviously, in a book of long-range history of ideas here, where part of the exercise is really just trying to map things, and I think less about the relationship one between the other. I mean, this is a series, as you pointed out at the beginning, Scott, of what I call figures of equality, from the kind of older sense of a figura, or a kind of a style or way of thinking about equality. And these overlap, and they're to some degree progressive, but you can find all the figures in the book at various points in human history. And so it's not teleological, as Stephen pointed out, and it's really not a causal history either, although I agree and fully endorse the work that you all are doing has practical consequences, right? I have the luxury of just pontificating about ideas, but somebody's got to go out there and recommend things to policymakers, and that's where you all come in. That's where the data comes in, and I'll help if I can, but my math is not as good as it should be. Yeah.
So another point that I wanted to bring up for discussion on the panel is this distinction that you make early in the book, and it's come up again this afternoon a couple of times, between equality and inequality. And that distinction reminded me a little bit of a lot of debates over the past couple of decades in political theory about what's the right orientation of political theorizing. Is it towards ideal theory, where we try and say, what is justice if we fully realize it, versus a less idealized approach to political theory, in which you try and say, the world is terrible in all sorts of ways, and wouldn't it be nice if it was less terrible? And I wonder if this discussion of equality versus inequality might be relevant to thinking about how we should orient ourselves toward those kinds of debates.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting when you mention justice and a kind of ideal. I mean, there is, of course, a lot of work in philosophy and political theory on equality, but it tends to be very, very abstract. And my frustration as a historian was, what about when the rubber hits the road? What about the, in this sense, empirical sort of uses of equality and inequality? And clearly they go directly together. I mean, Jenny mentioned the point that I make early in the book, and I'm drawing here on my colleague in the Netherlands, Siep Sturman, who is really the kind of doyen of historians thinking about equality. And Siep makes the point that equality is always imaginary, in the sense that when we look at the world empirically, we see difference right away, right? We all have different fingerprints. We all look different. We all have different predilections, and so on and so forth. It takes a kind of leap of imagination to imagine us as equals. And that's hard for human beings to do often. Not always, of course, and there are lots of good counterexamples, but it can be. And so that then becomes the project of moving from a vision of equality to a social vision, and making what we share part of a social imaginary. But that's always mapped against the inequality in the world. And so those two, you're absolutely right, go profoundly together.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, I actually wanted to know, I mean, Darrin starts the book by noting and going around and talking about his project on the history of equality. People keep thinking he was talking about inequality. And I think all of us, or at least I know I did, said inequality once when we were trying to say equality, or equality when they said inequality, which that slip kind of poses a real question.
Yeah.
And that many of us often think of equality as just being the opposite side of the same coin as inequality. And I think there is a tradition of thinking about equality as a problem of distribution, in which equality and inequality are the exact opposite, which would seem to conform with very I think, obvious social science methodologies in which, it's a question of distribution. I have more of it, you have less of it, and we can kind of study that empirically, and we can model that. We can think about mechanisms through which that happens that would kind of not make equality, inequality interchangeable, but at least kind of vice versa. But one of the most powerful strains in the book is that oftentimes equality doesn't reduce inequality, precisely, actually it increases it. There I thought, the discussion of domination was really important. And that they are talking about relational as opposed to distributive inequalities. And I just kind of wonder on kind of operationalizing that idea for social science research. Could that be done? To kind of show that equality increases inequality, and it isn't just a kind of trade-off. It's an inelegant way of putting it, but I'm just sort of curious to hear others' remarks on that on the panel.
Well, one can identify context where I think that would be true. So here's one example. Suppose the move to a civil service system, in which I have a meritocratic decision on who gets what job. People become more productive. That also means that the heterogeneity and the productivity of individuals may increase, and therefore their incomes increase, and therefore their political power differentials increase, so on and so forth. So in other words, part of the answer I would give is that there are straightforward contexts in which increasing equality of opportunity would also increase inequality of outcomes. So that would be one. I don't know if that's quite speaking to that. I think the second example you're looking for is more with respect to relational inequality. That the answer is I think one could do it, but that hasn't been the focus of formal models, at least the ones I know about. So I think that's a big challenge. But at least in some ways, there are environments where one would find that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on relational inequality, it's interesting to think about formal modeling. I can imagine doing, that's what I do, but I can imagine doing that. I think measuring relational inequality, so to put it into the empirical side of quantitative social science, would be a lot harder, I think, because the concept is it's less numerical. I think you're right that income inequality that's just numerical, right? Relational inequality. Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, but what were you looking for in the world to write down your numbers?
Yeah. You're looking for differentials in the respect that people are given, additional on certain statuses, and that.
I mean, that's what you're looking for, but
yes, I don't know how to measure it
between that and.
Yeah, I defer to the social scientists to figure out how social science can do this, and I go back to the empirical, but I think one case that makes Jonathan's point nicely is the transition in the 18th century from a hierarchy of orders, right, birth inequality, an aristocracy, to a meritocracy. Now, we don't often think about it, but a meritocracy is, of course, a hierarchy. It's just a hierarchy according to different criteria, and the founding fathers were really frank about this, right? Jefferson said we want to replace what he called the tinsel aristocracy, or Tom Paine called the no-ability, right, for the nobility. Titled aristocrats who inherited their wealth and their privilege and so forth. We want to replace that with what Jefferson calls, natural aristocrats, by which he means real, better people, right? Who will work harder, who are smarter, who are greater geniuses. And so you get a shift, an egalitarian shift away from a society of orders to one of competition. But what does that lead? Of course, it leads to new forms of hierarchy, and at some points, right now, for example, that are even greater than an older society of orders.
So I'll throw out a policy example for what it's worth. Suppose that Ivy League schools and Ivy equivalents switched from their current admissions policy to having a threshold above which everybody's admitted, and it's randomized. I think that you would find the hierarchies between students would be qualitatively different because we set the rules of the system differently. And so that's the sense in which having complete order meritocracy, which is kind of the way admissions work now, would be facilitating to greater relational inequality. So it seems to me that the measurement thing I think is extraordinarily hard, but one could at least envision mechanisms where we could draw conclusions.
So to continue on the theme of hierarchy for a minute, I think,
there too.
well, I don't know if you have something you want to say. You
No,
should
no,
say
no,
it
please.
before I have a
But,
question,
but I think it's an important
Yeah, I think
subject.
one thing that you emphasize is that equality and hierarchy go together. And I think when you think about equality and hierarchy, there's one kind of obvious direction, which is a position in a hierarchy is itself a kind of thing where you might worry about equality of privilege or power, things like that. But you also, I think you're very aware, you mentioned that hierarchy is functional in various ways. It's an allocation mechanism. And so I'm just curious about, how that thinking about hierarchy as doing something for you is related to thinking about equality in these various figures.
Yeah, boy, we have 3 more hours, right? So
well,
big,
3 more hours, 3 more minutes,
subject.
one of those.
Well, does this still work? Can I go to my slides? Is that possible, Jerry?
I think you can.
I have one slide at the end that I didn't show you. This is Webster's first dictionary of the English language. And you see there a definition of equal and equality, which is in fact similar. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? The polis aims to be composed as much as possible of similars and equals. And there, an equal is one of the same rank, right? An aristocrat of the same rank, right? Uniformity, similarity. Another way of describing this is peers, right? In fact, in Latin, there's the origin, pares, of the word peer refers to a social equal, which is distinguished from a political equal. Now, the point I make about hierarchy, and the reason why I said I think we need to talk about it, it's one of these subjects that makes most people uncomfortable, particularly academics. I mean, we have this kind of idea that we're fighting against hierarchy, but human beings are hierarchical creatures, and it's really difficult to get more than a small group of 50 or so together and not see it. And the sociologists will tell you that even you get a group like this together, people start making status judgments and gravitating towards others. We're status creatures. We've inherited that much from our ancestors. But hierarchy needn't be a bad thing. And hierarchy is opposed to domination, which is a kind of forced imposition on others. Hierarchy is often a socially agreed mechanism for sorting out things, who gets what, in what order, and so forth. And most hierarchies function that way. You don't question them, but they have that dangerous tendency of bleeding into domination, right? So that the hierarchy that we've agreed upon is no longer an agreement, it's rather a privilege of, as you say, of having parents who went to Ivy League colleges who then pay for all the right testing services to get their kids in the same. And that's, I think, where this interesting tension lies. But I guess my word here today would be a kind of plea for social scientists to think seriously about hierarchy. And the sociologists, to my mind, have been doing this better than anyone, with some psychologists as well. But we need to take it seriously and not only think of equality and hierarchy as opposites, because in more cases than not, they aren't. Pin drop.
So we're going to have time for some Q&A. Yeah. So I don't know if you have a microphone or not, but.
While we're waiting for the microphone, Jonathan mentioned this. I gave a series of lectures in Sweden years ago, and the title was The History of Equality. And they changed the name to The History of Inequality. And I thought to myself, we live in a world in which even Swedes can't imagine equality. We're doomed. This is a problem.
All right, so I saw a hand. No, you.
Yeah, I'll just stand up.
Sure. Here's the mic coming.
Hello, so my name is Navya Kapasetti, and I'm a second year here at Harris. So my question is, we hear a lot about Gen Z and baby boomers and the inequality. I watched a TED Talk recently with Scott Galloway, who talks about how Gen Z is like going to be struggling financially in like the long run. So could you talk about that when it comes across like the inequalities between the generations, like financially, socially, and like politically?
I think it's a great question, and keep talking about it because, you folks are going to have to pay the bills, right? I mean, it's tremendous, right? We talk about environmental waste and destruction and the legacy that leaves behind, but there's the debt, there's opportunity, the foreclosure of possibilities for our children and children that were there for us, and we have to really think about that. Equality between generations, I think it's a hugely important subject. Again, I wish I had, immediate answers for you. I don't, but I would just simply say, keep thinking about this and keep pushing that envelope because it's hugely important and it's going to impact all our lives. Some, the younger folks in the audience more than others. I don't know if you all.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Anand. I'm a first-year MPP student. I want to ask that when we talk about the social structure becoming dominant, so the idea of so their domination is again boils down to their idea of who holds the vested interest over whom, and we see in a history of humanity, human beings coming up with the moral and ethical experiments in the sake of religions, and they are trying to kind of giving this breakthrough which political or economical structures may not give in terms of distribution of resources or allocating value to equal part and for the equal sector of society. So how we see the promises of those institutions which can shape public morality, public ethics to build this broader foundation which economical or political models may or may not give us a very clear-cut answers. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a direct answer, but again, a wonderful question, and I'll just say this. So one of the people I draw on in an essential way in the book is the late sociologist Robert Bellah, who was actually one of my teachers at Berkeley. And his last main book is a book about religion in the evolution of humanity from, the Paleolithic until the Axial Age. And the insight that Bellah makes there is that the axial religions, and this is a phrase that was coined by a German philosopher in the post-war period, to describe these faith traditions around whose axis we continue to revolve, right? Essentially the world great religions, and then Islam and Christianity a little bit later, he dates it back. But Bellah makes the point that these axial religions rise up in response to the tremendous inequities of the dominant states of the time. And think Egypt, right, with Pyramid, Pharaoh and his companions ruling 99% of the society. And it was a protest against that you see in classical Judaism and classical Hinduism, in the Taoist tradition that I mentioned, and many others, a kind of calling out of the inequality and a plea to common human fellowship. And I think all religious traditions have that power. And Martin Luther King is a great example of this, drawing on both an deep embedded Indian tradition and deep embedded Christian tradition to reanimate the egalitarian impulse that's there potentially in religion. Now, of course, religion's also very good at doing the opposite, right? Of justifying hierarchies, of justifying caste, of justifying distinctions. And we live at a time right now in the contemporary United States when at least the Christian faith traditions are on that side, by and large. But in the 19th century, when King was looking back to his heroes, well, he found they were Protestant abolitionists. They were people who were really pushing the envelope on all the questions of the day: the worker question, the women question, the slave question, and so on and so forth. And so again, just as I said to your colleague, the young woman who asked the first question, keep asking that question, keep demanding of your religious leaders maybe to read the gospel a little bit more closely, or go back to some of these foundational texts, which, as I say, are embedded in all traditions. I showed you Zhuangzi, but there are lots of them.
her immeasurability of inequality, I know there's not maybe an ethnographer or social psychologist in the house, but there may be a possible metric of empathy whereby you invoke this recent native category of feelings and the lived experience of inequality could be an empirical starting point in terms of trying to measure the perception and misery, the lived experience of inequality as, perhaps the most relevant, parameter politically, if not also just morally.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say very quickly that, so one of the themes of the book is that equality is always about emotion. Montesquieu describes equality, the feeling in a democracy is the love of equality. It's a feeling, right, about, and highlighting that in distinction to the misery, as you say, the pain of inequality and exclusion. And magnifying that in the politics, I think, is hugely, hugely powerful. And social movements always kind of operationalize that. Whether you can measure it or not, I don't know. That gets harder, but I'm sure there are scales for it. I don't know. What do you all think? I mean, it sounds like, Stephen, you're working on this a little bit, right?
I think that's a great idea. If you ask the question about changing the rule, think about the admissions example I gave. And the ethnography of the attitudes of college students would be deeply informative as to whether that would have a demonstrable effect. And so it is very much the case that the comments we made had to do with one source of evidence, which is quantitative, but there was no intent to diminish the significance of others and qualitative, and this may be a context where the qualitative is the only way to go.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for at least one more.
Hi, my name is Mauricio. I'm a first year here at Harris. My question is, it's a bit philosophical, but has a practical standpoint. To what extent do you think inequality and equality are inseparable? From a practical standpoint speaking, when you try to enforce equality, aren't you inevitably enforcing inequality, like taxes, progressive tax rates, and so on?
Again, I'll give my brief historical one and then defer to my social scientist colleagues. So I gave you that citation from the Webster's Dictionary about equality as uniformity, but I juxtaposed that at the very beginning of the book with a line by W.E.B. Du Bois in The Crisis around the time of the First World War. And he says there that the equality that modern human beings want is not sameness, right? It's difference and a recognition of difference. And that's something that's been very important in contemporary politics, what is styled identity politics. I don't like that term, and I think rightly so. I mean, the feminist philosopher Joan Scott famously said that equality is difference, and I think that's right insofar as we think about equality is finding common ground between you and I. And we can say, oh yeah, we're both, here in Chicago, we're both Chicagoans, we're equal on that basis. But that equality claim takes for granted the fact that all sorts of other things about us will be different, and that's okay, right? And so deciding what we want to identify, well, okay, we have common rights as equals, as Chicagoans, or we have common privileges or common access, and then we can work out those things. But difference will always be around it. The counter to that, though, again, and I think this is something that the contemporary right in this country has really insisted upon, is that there is also this idea of kind of, equals are alike, right? Equals are similar or same. And we should, bind together a circle of equals to the exclusion of those who are not. And then they make claims about who's equal and who's not. And that's there as well. And I think that's been the kind of pushback to identity politics that we see on the right that we're obviously struggling with very much right now.
I think one more thing to add to that is if you think about interventions that are going to make society more equal in some respect, once you see the manifold respects in which people have debated and talked about and valued equality, for plausible, historically relevant examples of human populations, there might well be a tendency to always push together toward equality on one of those dimensions and away on another one.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it has to be like that. We only know about the societies that we've seen, not all the societies that are possible. But
And of course, it can generate resentments.
yeah.
I think that point's important. There's a very high dimension for different types of equalities and inequalities, and you're going to have to take a stance on them. So let me give an example. Suppose that you and I, suppose I have an insurance policy, okay, or people have insurance policies. What is that doing? It is reducing the ex post risk, but of course you could say that's not fair because we're paying different amounts for the insurance. And I don't know if I was very clear about that, but in other words, we can agree to dimensions where we would increase inequality in order to reduce it in other dimensions. And so that's the sense in which there could be a free lunch. I don't think that's true for any interesting policy questions, but I would start by saying you have to define the specific phenomena and then ask what trade-offs adhere to that.
All right, so thank you all for the questions. It was a really wonderful part of the event. I'm going to make a couple of announcements before I invite you to clap for the panel here. There's going to be a reception afterwards, and you can just, if you want to, stay where you are. We're not going to move the seats. People will be coming around with things for you to enjoy, although there are also tables over on the side. And there is also, our friends from the Seminary Co-op are here. As I said, you should read the book, and that's a fine place to acquire it. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. Thank the panel for being here. Thank you.